Greetings, it is I, Commissar Benkov. What would happen if Russia and USA met in an artificial arena island where their land masses are next to each other? As usual, nuclear arsenals are off limits and morale is not accounted for. First to reach the enemy would be missiles and aircraft. Russia has fewer cruise missiles and their firing platforms. Some do have longer reach though. Its tactical ballistic missile force is a mix of large modern missiles and small Cold War era missiles. US ballistic missile assets fall somewhere in between. Some would be fired onto supply depots, large army groups and known SAM sites, but a very obvious target set would be the airfields. Such disparity in numbers would also mean larger number of neutralized Russian forces, especially aircraft trapped on unusable air bases. US has a lot more combat planes, and they're all fairly modern. US pilots also train more. Russia still relies quite a bit on unmodernized Cold War platforms. That applies to roughly half of their planes, vehicles and ships. Number of bombers-wise, Russia is almost equivalent to the US. US air fleet features mostly multi-role planes, while Russia has only recently started to use such planes in larger numbers. Russia also lacks modern weapons, especially long-range air-to-air missiles and guided bombs. Such missiles have only started to trickle into their air force last year. One area where Russia has the upper hand is ground-based air defenses. While US has basically just the Patriot SAM system, Russia has a far more layered inventory. It also has a wide array of medium-range SAMs. US has no such systems. Only remaining US SAM assets are its Avenger units with tiny Stinger missiles. While the US Navy has a vast fleet of air defense ships, its use over Russian airspace would be limited at best. Russia would create a layered SAM network for the attacker to penetrate. Performing deep strikes would be very costly for the US. Stealth strike planes should do somewhat better in such environment, but there aren't many of them. Leftover Russian Air Force would most likely choose to fall back on its air bases away from the front line and intercept or harass the incoming enemy strike sorties. Still, even attacks over the front line would favor the US, given the disparity in numbers and quality of air forces. Russian doctrine of rugged planes operating from less than perfect airfields and a large number of such Cold War air bases would mean the Russians would continuously challenge the invaders and force them to waste part of their fighter fleet as escorts. Thus, the US force would not often venture out farther than a few hundred kilometers behind the enemy lines. On the ground, the US force is more numerous. Its top-tier force are active-duty army units and Marine Corps. The National Guard trains several weeks a year, and it is a useful addition. Half of the Russian active duty force features conscripts, which have less experience than professional soldiers. Russian paramilitary force, however, is much larger than the US one. It does lack proper combined arms experience and is best used as a defensive force. Russian citizens have an obligation to serve in the reserve, but very few actually train, and there's equipment stored for some 80,000. Both sides would surely be conscripting additional troops, with or without army experience. Here the US has a larger pool, but it would be questionable how many such unwilling conscripts would be ready for service within a year. While only selected few US units have tanks and heavy vehicles, Russian doctrine calls for such vehicles in almost every infantry brigade. When it comes to actual maneuver units in the active duty and National Guard, for US they feature some 330,000 soldiers. Russia has 213,000 soldiers in such units. The discrepancy in ratio is again due to different doctrines. Russian units are firepower heavy and don't carry a lot of support with them. They're expected to operate inside or close to Russia, mostly in defensive operations or counterattack ops. US units are more offensive in nature and are more self-sufficient logistics-wise. Beside the stored hardware for the reserve brigades, Russia has a much larger pool of ex-Soviet equipment, part of which could be used by mobilized conscripts. It is questionable, though, how much of it could be put into proper service. Fairly flat landmass of Western Russia would suit slightly more the Russian army, with its greater emphasis on heavy vehicles. But it would also mean more problems for Russian air defenses and favor the strong suit of US surveillance, blocking the armored counterattacks. mostly safe from enemy airstrikes, numerically superior US forces would set the initiative. They would slowly and methodically erode defenses. What they may lack in firepower, they would cover for with better situational awareness, more air power support, and greater mobility. The cost, however, would include considerable losses. US has many more attack and transport helicopters and a much larger transport plane capacity. It could swiftly relocate more of its troops where they are needed and support larger formations behind enemy lines. Navy-wise, a conflict in the open seas would be a disaster for Russia. Its fleet is many times smaller and fairly old. Russia would stick to its coast. It would use its more numerous coastal assets. It could use its conventional submarines more efficiently, as well as use mines and land-based coastal missile batteries. Still, it would be just a matter of months before US landing fleet could seek additional points of entry onto Russian soil. It might mean more Russian troops tied to defense of the rear regions, instead of defending against the main US assault. Another important area of comparison would be the intelligence gathering capabilities. The US has a large advantage in the satellite inventory. Russia also has fewer aerial recon assets, be it optical or electronic surveillance. With all that, US would, after a period of grinding down the defenses, be set to push inside Russia. Allowing for realistic climate, winter would slow down the US approach. Russia would also benefit from its large territory, meaning they could retreat and trade territory for time, stretching out the US forces. Fast US advance deep inside enemy territory, where supply lines would be in danger, is less likely. US advance would take its time. Rather than risk disproportionately large casualties, they might choose to grab less land. Within a year, a fair part of European Russia might fall to the US, but still a sizable part would remain. War would be of a scale US hasn't seen since World War II, and hundreds of thousands of casualties on either side would not be unexpected. Allowing for more than a year, the scenario would only further accentuate US economy and population advantage. Eventually, the great disparity in numbers and quality, leading to territory lost, would put Russia on the losing side. Winner, United States of America. Of course, in the real world, there is a whole ocean between the two countries, so US invading Russia might then give quite a different set of results. Also, a possible nuclear exchange would surely give no decisive winner.